Caution: the AJ and Quill show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. Hi everyone, welcome to Total Party Quill. As always, I'm Professor AJ, your friendly neighborhood tiefling, and with me is my fearless lab companion, Quill the Dragon. Say hi, Quill.
Greetings, puny humans. Prepare to absorb the knowledge Quill will dispense with his mighty jaws.
Now, with the Guide to Ravenloft coming out soon, containing interesting things like a new Undead Pact Warlock and undead patrons, and the general overall undead feel of Ravenloft in general,
we've decided to cover boss monsters or potential patrons you might encounter inside Ravenloft.
Right, namely we're going to be focusing on the DeathKnight, the Lich, and the Mummy Lord.
All powerful undead creatures, each with their own flavor.
And we think you're going to have a lot of fun using these either as a Warlock patron or even a potential big bad guy inside your Ravenloft campaign.
But let's not waste any more time. What are we covering today?
Today we're going to be covering DeathKnights.
Wait, I thought this was Dungeons & Dragons, not World of Warcraft.
Actually, they had DeathKnights in Dungeons & Dragons long before World of Warcraft was a thing.
When a corrupt warrior dies without making amends for its misdeeds, he or she can be raised as a Death Knight.
A Death Knight is an undead warrior that somehow remains a tenuous link to the divine powers that it used before.
And like all undead, Death Knights are motivated by a compulsion.
Right, an undead compulsion is the driving force for why an undead creature is doing what it does. But let's look at the stats. A Death Knight is a medium undead with a CR of 17.
They have a speed of 30 feet and dark vision out to 120 feet.
And they have 19 D8 hit points.
They have amazing physical and mental stats,
as well as all the standard high-level undead resistances and abilities. And inside the stat block for a Death Knight, you can see that they have a martial undead ability.
This shows them to be not only just an undead, but a leader of undead.
Right, like a general.
The example in the monster manual also comes with spell slots, a tremendous longsword multi-attack, and the Hellfire Orb ability.
Right, these are very powerful creatures, and they should make an interesting addition to any undead campaign. They're versatile and they can be used in a number of different ways. But let's look into the lore a little bit, just so that we can understand why these stats.
A Death Knight is a mighty warrior that's been reanimated as an undead creature by either a benevolent god, a god of undeath, evil deities, or demon lords or archdevils.
Now, typically, paladins would usually be the ones that are raised as Death Knights, but that's not exclusive. Warriors, barbarians, and rangers can all be raised as Death Knights in the lore.
Now, a Death Knight is a skeleton, not a zombie.
Right, if you see any rotting flesh or muscle on this thing, it is not a Death Knight.
You can become a Death Knight by more than following a good god.
Demons like Orcus and Demogorgon are well known for creating their own Death Knights. And if you look at Descent into Avernus, the Archdevil Zerial even made one of her own generals into a Death Knight.
Now, despite their CR 17, they're a pretty simple stat block. The developers struggled to find a place for Death Knights, while also trying to differentiate them as much as possible from Liches.
Right, and to a lesser extent Mummy Lords. And if you look at the monster manual, the Death Knight that they depict there was obviously a high-level paladin before it got turned.
Hence the spells.
But if this were a ranger or a barbarian, then that would be different.
If you look at the stat block, you can see a Death Knight does a tremendous amount of necrotic damage with its longsword attack.
And you can see the Hellfire Orb ability, which does both fire and necrotic damage.
And lots of it.
Now to explain these stats, you have to look back at the early days of D&D and what the Death Knights were. They were always really powerful spellcasters, but it wasn't until 5th edition that they simplified them into being basically a melee brute.
Hellfire Orb is a callback to the original Death Knight that was able to cast the fabled 20-die fireball.
Right, in 1st and 2nd edition, Death Knights could cast a fireball that let you roll 20 dice.
Go Nova!
Now, in the lore, there are actually 2 different kinds of Death Knights. And in the monster manual, we really only see one that's been depicted.
In the monster manual, you see a fallen paladin that's been cursed by its own gods. They're forced to suffer until they redeem themselves, after which only then would they be allowed to die.
Now, there is another kind of Death Knight that's not covered here. There are individuals who would actively seek out these powers to deliberately become a Death Knight. Kind of like how a wizard would actually look into becoming a lich.
Or how individuals will deliberately try to become vampires.
Now, the thing is, the term Death Knight is actually used pretty colloquially.
It tends to cover a broad spectrum of undead knights. Demon lords like Orcus and Demogorgon have been transforming people into Death Knights for a very long time.
Right, and other powerful demon lords or archdevils conceivably could do the exact same thing.
In Descent into Avernus, one of Zariel's commanders was a Death Knight named Olanthius.
Zariel turned him into a Death Knight.
And there is something that makes Death Knights special.
So this begs the question, what's the difference between, say, a skeleton in knightly armor or a really powerful vampire wearing full plate and a Death Knight?
And there is a difference.
Now, what makes Death Knights so special and different, it actually revolves around the rituals that turn them into one.
If you're a fallen paladin and you get cursed into being a Death Knight, your god will do most of the heavy lifting.
Right, but if you're doing this yourself or actively seeking to become a Death Knight, you would be responsible for providing all the rituals and materials necessary to do so.
Now, the main point of this ritual is that you must commit an act of great evil. Very similar to what the Dark Powers would have to go through in order to grow themselves their own death domain in the Shadowfell and become a Dread Lord.
Right, like how Strahd or Lord Soth did. Now, any evil act isn't going to cut it. The key to this evil act is that it has to be so heinous that even the most depraved and evil creature would flat out refuse to do it.
It has to be something so evil that your soul is literally fractured.
This is something that a normal evil person wouldn't be able to do, like murdering a loved one or betraying somebody that they normally wouldn't betray. Something very, very evil.
Kind of like what Thanos had to do to Gamora.
Now, the other key point to this is that this evil act must be done with your blade.
The weapon that marks them as a warrior.
At the end of the ritual, you will be burned in an unholy green fire. It will scorch and mark your armor. It will burn away all of your flesh, leaving behind only blackened bone. The green cursed fire tears your soul out, and it binds it into your weapon, similar to a lich's phylactery.
You see why they struggled to separate Death Knights from liches?
From that conflagration rises the soulless bones of the once living, guided by an evil intelligence that no longer needs a brain for its vile thoughts and an endless hatred that no longer requires a heart to drive its passions.
The soul weapon is similar to a lich's phylactery in that the Death Knight's soul resides inside it and not inside of their body.
Right, but in almost every other single way, it's almost the exact opposite of a phylactery. You see, a lich's phylactery is actually a weakness, and it's the one thing that would allow for a lich's permanent destruction.
Whereas the soul weapon is a Death Knight's greatest strength.
Right, the Death Knight is literally wielding its own soul as a weapon. This is why you see all that extra damage on its longsword attacks.
It is said that a soul weapon's strike burns with death.
And it's also the reason you see Death Knights depicted as skeletons. The unholy green fire burned away all their flesh.
Wait. But what happens if you destroy a Death Knight's weapon?
Well, unlike a lich, it does nothing. A Death Knight never fear its soul weapon's destruction, for with a thought, the Death Knight can restore the weapon to wholeness and unwholesome power.
To kill a Death Knight, you have to do it the traditional way.
Once killed, the Death Knight's soul weapon will shatter. And then it's basically up to the gods or the demon lords that created them about whether or not they're going to send them back.
Exactly. Killing a Death Knight doesn't mean you get rid of it forever. It can always come back.
And unlike a lich, there's not really a way to prevent it from coming back.
If their gods wants the Death Knight punished further, it will simply send them back to the mortal realm to continue its undead life.
Right, and if a demon lord created a Death Knight, it'll determine if it wants to go back and be a Death Knight or not. Now, Death Knights are actually depicted as being quite unique, and the powers they have are actually just as unique.
The one depicted in the monster manual is just one example.
Right, but as we said, Paladins, warriors, rangers can all become Death Knights.
As a DM, you would have to adjust the statistics to compensate for this.
Now, generally, Death Knights keep their personalities and the intelligence that they had from their former life.
However, regardless of its personality, a Death Knight becomes brooding and wrathful in death.
They literally carry their souls in their bony hands.
A constant reminder of a bargain that cannot be undone.
A Death Knight forgoes all other joys, and the choice weighs upon every immortal moment.
If a Death Knight makes any long-term connection to another creature, typically it will be its mount.
Right, Death Knights are usually depicted riding nightmares or skeletal horses, but any kind of powerful undead or evil mount should suffice.
The Death Knight in Descent into Avernus was said to ride a chariot pulled by 2 gorgons.
Now, speaking of Olanthius, you can see in the artwork that it looks like he has a face, and you don't really see a sword anywhere. Does that mean he's a Death Knight?
Of course he is.
If you look at his face, this is probably more an actual full-face helm with a mask on it. And he actually does have a sword. You just have to look for it. If you look at the stained glass artwork inside the adventure, you can see him here holding a weapon. Now, it's said that a Death Knight grows to despise all life in general. But even so, there's still always a chance for redemption.
A Death Knight that chooses to spend its undeath doing good and performing heroic acts can actually be granted a new mortal life and a second chance.
Right, this transformation into undeath basically opens the floodgates for different points of view.
It unrestrains the morality of a Death Knight.
Right. For example, if a knight only did good while it was alive because it feared what would happen when it died if it was evil, well, that fear's not there anymore. It's just going to act how it would want to act.
If that was evil, it will be evil.
It's kind of like the super soldier serum. Anything good is amplified, anything bad is made worse.
So being turned into a Death Knight by their own god is actually a trial for that knight. Their god wants to see their true colors.
Now, a very important point to note is that a Death Knight always keeps the honor that it had in life.
What we mean is that even as fallen paladins, Death Knights still fight honorably.
Right, they don't ambush opponents, they don't strike from behind, they don't kick opponents' weapons away.
They retain their honor, even if they're evil.
Now, undead, for the purpose of motivation, we say that they have a compulsion that they must feel. For example, vampires have a compulsion to feed on blood.
But what compulsion would a Death Knight have?
Well, there's 2 that we can think of. One is to punish.
Punish whom or what? Does it even matter?
Not really. The second compulsion that a Death Knight could possibly have is redemption.
A Death Knight may actively be seeking to redeem itself from its actions.
Now, side note, Death Knights are also cursed to forever remember the evil deed they committed in song.
Any night where there's a full moon, you can hear a Death Knight singing its sad song. It's said to be a terrifying and chilling melody echoing throughout the moonlit countryside of a Death Knight's domain.
Right, and Death Knights are very likely to attack anybody who dares interrupt its song. But let's put all this together. How do Death Knights behave in combat?
A Death Knight has exceptional stats, with a very high strength and constitution, as well as a large reservoir of hit points.
Right, this means that it's going to act like a melee tank.
It also has above-average mental stats, and its charisma is exceptionally high.
This means that a Death Knight isn't an unthinking brute, and you can talk to it.
They also have proficiency in wisdom and dexterity saving throws.
Right, that covers 2 of the big 3 saving throws.
They also have the standard high-level undead resistances.
Now, there are 3 things that make this a very tough monster to fight. Its longsword multi-attack, all of the spells that it can cast, and its martial undead ability. But let's cover that last one first. Martial Undead is an ability that the Death Knight can grant to creatures near it.
Any undead creature within 60 feet of the Death Knight now has resistance to being turned.
Now, this typically depicts the Death Knight much more as a leader or a general of other undead creatures. And if you look over at the Targets in Area Effect table that can be found in the Dungeon Master's Guide, you can see that reasonably you could expect to have at least 12 other creatures inside this area of effect.
What this means is that you can expect a Death Knight to be joined by up to 12 other creatures.
Now, what kind of undead you have accompanying it is really up to you and how difficult you want to make the encounter.
Skeletons, zombies, shadows, ghouls, ghast, mummies, specters, rites, race. All make sense.
Right, but higher level undead like a lich or a mummy lord or a vampire wouldn't be included in this because they're boss creatures all in their own right.
As a note, Death Knights can also be created by fiends, so it's not unreasonable to have a group of fiends also following the Death Knight.
Right, but if they're fiends, this ability will do nothing for them. But what you could do is you could change the ability for a Death Knight that was created by a demon lord or an archdevil, and you can make it so that that ability also affects fiends, because there are classes that have turning abilities that do affect fiends.
The second thing that makes them so hard to fight is their spell casting.
Right, a Death Knight is a 19th level spellcaster. They get 2 smite spells, both of which they can use as bonus actions to really enhance the Death Knight's action economy.
Granted, they're not the best smites in the list, but it's still something.
They also get spells like Banishment and Hold Person, which are tremendous for crowd control.
And they can really mess up the action economy of the opposing side.
And it has a 5th level destructive wave spell that it can use.
And it has 2 5th level spell slots to use it with, and nothing else to spend those slots on.
And we can't talk about its spellcasting ability without also covering Hellfire Orb, the 20 dice damage fireball that does half necrotic damage. Now, we're going to assume that the half fire, half necrotic represents some kind of hellfire.
You could even depict it as being green.
Now, if we look at the targets and area effect table, you can see that you should expect to get at least 4 creatures inside this ability.
So, if a Death Knight ever sees 4 creatures that it can get within the radius, it will use its Hellfire Orb every time.
And since this technically isn't a spell, you can also use it with, say, bonus action spells that you may or may not have.
Let's go over some of the other spells.
Spell Magic, great spell to hold on to until the Death Knight gets a chance to figure out how threatening or dangerous enemy spellcasters are going to be.
Or if there's any crowd control or wall effects in place that it can dispel.
Or buff spells like Haste or Bless.
Command can be a fun spell against being swarmed.
And Banishment is a great spell to get rid of anybody who's being really annoying to the Death Knight. Now, personality-wise, Death Knights aren't really afraid of anything, and they won't retreat from combat. Typically, when a creature gets down to 1/4 of its total hit points, we say they suffer a morale failure and try to flee from combat. But that's not going to happen with the Death Knight. You have to kill it till it's dead.
Death Knights will typically charge to the front lines and engage the enemy directly,
while also directing any minions that accompanied it to fight the other opponents.
Remember, if a Death Knight is fighting your PCs, its primary compulsion is to destroy anyone it feels compelled to punish.
Right, because if their compulsion is going to be redemption, they're not likely to fight your player characters, but if their compulsion is punishment, then they are.
In combat, a Death Knight will cast Hold Person to paralyze any frontline PCs that it's engaged with in order to make the most out of its hack and slash multi-attack.
Right, and while engaged in melee combat, if at least 3 opponents are within the area of effect for its destructive wave ability, it's going to use that instead.
Rinse and repeat that for melee combat.
Now, Banishment is going to be used against a single opponent other than the ones that it's engaged with in melee,
like, say, healers or hit-and-run rogues who are doing lots of damage.
But remember that Banishment is also a concentration spell, so it's going to compete for its concentration with any other spell that the Death Knight is going to want to cast, including smite spells. Now, Compel Duel is on the list, but you're not really going to use it, because it's not actually hard to get player characters to attack a giant undead creature.
Command can function as a poor man's Compel Duel, but you're better off using it to make them go prone.
Right, the option to grovel would do this.
In melee combat, prone creatures grant advantage to people attacking it within 5 feet.
And finally, it's Hellfire Orb ability. Now, when you see an ability that's limited, like Hellfire Orb is, then the creature is going to be a lot more picky about when it uses that ability.
It has to ration them out.
Right, as such, we're going to say that there's going to be at least 2 conditions that need to be met before a Death Knight will use its Hellfire Orb ability.
1. There are at least 4 enemies in the blast radius.
Right, this is pretty simple. It would want to get at least 4 creatures inside the radius of the spell.
Number 2. At least half the creatures inside the radius must have pissed off the Death Knight.
Right, The Death Knight has actively got to be angry at who's ever in the radius.
The Hellfire Orb is a punishment on top of another punishment that the Death Knight's victims have already earned themselves.
And lastly for abilities, a Death Knight has the parry reaction ability.
This would allow them to add 6 to their armor class as a reaction after being hit.
Right, so with their AC, that means if a creature rolls between 20 and 25 to hit the Death Knight, then the Death Knight would use this ability. But anything lower or higher than that, and there's really no point.
And there's no point in saving this ability. It's a reaction. You get it back at the start of every turn. So if you can use it, then use it.
Right, you should always use this ability when it comes up, unless you're saving that reaction for maybe an opportunity attack. Then you're probably fine holding on to it, but still, this is a really good ability, and you shouldn't waste it.
Now we spoke about Death Knights and their mounts.
Right, typically you would see a Death Knight like Lord Soth riding a Nightmare. But there's also depictions of them riding other creatures, like Olanthius in his chariot pulled by 2 Gorgons.
Super cool.
Now, honestly, the tactics for a Death Knight when it's mounted don't change.
Being mounted is just a way to give a Death Knight increased speed and more mobility.
Now, some mounts, like Nightmares, are actually intelligent enough to be considered independent mounts, but because you're the DM and you control both anyway, this doesn't really make a difference.
A mount in combat generally should take the disengage action so that it can move freely without suffering opportunity attacks with its rider.
Right, and it could also take the dash action if it needed to cover a lot of ground very quickly. And that's it. We hope this gets you started on using and enjoying Death Knights inside your campaign.
And we hope that it helps you with the upcoming release of Guide to Ravenloft.
But now it's time for Quill's Joke of the Day. Quill?
What do you call a knight that is afraid to fight?
I don't know. What do you call a knight that's afraid to fight?
You call him Sir Render.
Anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in. We hope this helps get you started using Death Knights. We'll see you next time. Remember, we love you all. Wear a mask when you go outside. Try to love each other, and it's time for school yet?
Bye.
Yeah, 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 yeah.